I'm Dr. Stephen Graves, Assistant Professor in the Department of Black Studies at the University of Missouri. I specialize in my research in Black politics, Black political thought, and American government. The courses in my research area that I teach here at Mizzou as an affiliate in the Department of Political Science and at the Kinder Institute include Intro to Black Studies, Black political thought, African political thought, and Intro to Black Studies and Race in the American Story. I am pleased to be able to have this opportunity to have this lecture on contested elections, electoral calamities, and controversial changes in presidential power. In this specific case today, I will be talking most importantly about this idea of white fragility in the 2020 election as it relates to the outcomes that we've seen with 2020 election and the following insurrection on January 6th. So it'll be my goal as I share this presentation to go a little bit over what we've seen, the case and behind it, and the discussion as far as what the 2020 election kind of meant in regards to American governments, the kind of issues that kind of role play into it, but most importantly, kind of what it means overall as we kind of talk about what we've seen, the growing discussion out of it, and the kind of continued progress or lack of thereof that we'll continue to see as we kind of move forward, as we look at the kind of American political landscape. So at the most kind of important thing as we kind of get talking about here is this idea of white fragility. This is important concept when we talk about the insurrection and the kind of what we've seen in the kind of post discussion after the election, post January 6th discussion in particular. Obviously and clearly the vast majority of those who participated in the January 6th insurrection were white. So we're basing this discussion of the kind of post 2020 election and the discussion and growing kind of rhetoric and nationalism that is kind of taking place under this guise of the kind of the position of whiteness at the white dominant political majority here, right? So we're talking about white fragility. We're talking about the kind of delicate or vulnerable, easily broken or damaged. In particular, we're talking about the kind of political and economic unity, political and economic benefits, or I guess you can say kind of standing in particular. So feelings or behaviors that occur when white people face stressors. And we're talking about two particular political and economic stressors, right? So things that can kind of cause the white dominant majority to act outside of or kind of behave in vulnerable and or delicate ways, or we're talking about the kind of moral fabric or even just the kind of institutional framework of many of our American political institutions being easily broken or easily damaged when whites feel stressors, racial stressors, particularly in economic and political landscapes, right? So when whites feel like their economic standing and their place is somewhat being threatened, this can cause obviously a stressor that would be or cause some kind of vulnerability or easily broken kind of fabric of our political institutions, right? And same with political stressors, right? The idea of course, as we've seen more recently, like a growing minority voter representation, increased voter candidates, and increased immigration and increased immigrants who vote in elections. All these things then act as political stressors. All these things then cause stressors and thus then result in this idea of white fragility as in the aspect of the kind of strength of the kind of democratic framework. And particularly we're talking about the ability to be equal participants as far as whites and other ethnic groups in the American democracy. That becomes broken and or damaged in particular, again, when whites feel economic and political stressors as a result of what is perceived and sometimes is echoed as progress made by other ethnic groups outside of it, right? This is particularly of interest when we're talking about the 2020 election, because really prior to really 2016 and sometimes before, whiteness was thought to be some of this an invisible due to whites' dominant position and ability to claim the mainstream, right? So we really didn't have to have a hearty discussion about the kind of political behaviors and social and certain kind of stressors of political advantages when it came to whiteness as a kind of ethnic group that was worthy of independent study, because they were the norm. They were the standard for which all other ethnic groups could become measured by and thus judged by. So the idea of having to kind of use whiteness as a mobilizing, unifying factor for political behavior really wasn't necessarily one of importance of study really until other ethnic groups started beginning advantages as far as rights to vote and et cetera. And there was again this idea that the kind of mainstream position of whites was somewhat threatened. But this really has not really been the case. The white dominant majority has been obviously in a position of first position of standing throughout this country, and have always had the ability to claim the kind of mainstream culture, the mainstream political juggernaut and or kind of leader of the kind of direction that the country was moving. So the idea of kind of whiteness being this kind of invisible thing that really wasn't necessarily included in much independent study when talking about the kind of fluctuations and democratic processes, mainly because, again, it was a dominant position. It really was the standard for which all other ethnic groups became measured by. Today, though, what we have seen is a large portion of whites who actively identify with their racial group or with whiteness, and thus they support policies and candidates that they perceive as protecting whites' power and status. A growing third-party group from the Tea Party on, and what we've seen now with other advocate groups like the Proud Boys and others, what we've seen is that, and even elected officials who kind of speak of a rhetoric we have seen obviously throughout American history, but even more particularly, even with outside, one thing with Donald Trump and some others we have seen are people who are outside of electoral politics, those who have not previously run for office, but when they espouse the kind of views and protect the kind of interests of whites, then that automatically catapults them into this political spectrum for which all other kind of rational thought when it comes to the voting process really goes out necessarily the window. So thus then this idea of whiteness now has become this protected shield, the protected class, and we'll get to some of those reasons of why that is. And thus now it has become a juggernaut for which whites cannot identify with. And now it is used politically and particularly to really kind of support policies and candidates that they view as protecting whites, again, that power and status. And they support then candidates and policies that they perceive to really do those things. This comes down really into two really important issues that we want to divide these by, right? Material-based versus rights-based. Material-based issues, we're talking about tangible resources. We're talking about funding for public schools. We're talking about access to healthcare, funding for healthcare, universal healthcare, minimum wage increases, things like that are deemed as material-based, right? Rights-based issues are things like Second Amendment, the right to assembly, freedom of speech, and those type of issues. Both of these issues both have a protective interest by whites, but both of these have separate issues when it comes to the relationship with African Americans. So in particular, the idea of material-based things are much more harder to come by. You are much less likely to see issues that affect the material-based standing of African Americans or other ethnic groups, very rarely, if ever, really getting general supports from whites. Whereas rights-based issues are deemed to be much more universal and having much more access and gaining much more access of approval. But this really highlights in this idea of this idea of white fragility and this idea of zero-sum politics. Whereas any increase in the material-based interest of Blacks or other ethnic groups is automatically seen as becoming at the interest or at the behest of the white population, right? So any progress made, any increase in the white and Blacks' economic strength, wages, or general salaries, that must mean that then the white salaries must be coming down, or that there must not be an increase or less of an increase or any sign of any or an unmeasured progress that is significant or more advantageous to Blacks or other ethnic groups, automatically then must be coming at the expense of whites, right? Any economic standing, right? If more Blacks are being elected or more other diverse ethnic groups are being elected or having access to politics, then that must be coming at the expense of whites, right? That white voters must be being disenfranchised, or white kids must be not be getting the same education because there's been an increase in other ethnic groups access and teachers material-based interest in the classroom, that these must be coming at the expense then of whites, right? So this idea of zero-sum politics in the white political psyche then really plays into this idea of their fragility when it comes to political issues and economic issues, when they see as any increase outside of the white dominant majority now being coming at their expense. This also then comes into issue with the changing demographics of the country in a couple other ways. White people are once again getting older. We have the issue of the browning of America, right? So a lot of the things we've seen, one with the issue of abortion that not a lot of people think about is, as much as it's about religion and as much as it's about the religious landscape, the issue of abortion is also about the kind of growing demographics and the stagnation of a growing population of America, right? It's been for the first time in many of years that we have seen that the birth rate of America has slowed down or has stopped and it's not increased. And this is obviously for a plethora of reasons, but one, of course, is that again, is that most poor and or younger people are not having kids or else it is at a rate. But nevertheless, what has been the result, of course, is this idea we have seen play out through the press and through the media, is that the browning of America, right? That by the year 2035 and by 2050, that there will be a shift and the white dominant majority will no longer be a dominant majority, and that brown and black people will eventually take over as the dominant ethnic group combined in the country. And this is very important that we highlight on this idea of combined, because the idea, of course, is that it won't be a single ethnic group that will necessarily overtake whites as a dominant majority. Whites as a ethnic group or as identifying character will still be the dominant ethnic group in the country. It's just that for the first time in the country, African Americans and Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans combined will overtake whites as a dominant population in the country. This, of course, then as a fear-based initiative, then it really kind of plays again on this idea of fragility. Things again that have really put whites in a position for which they face perceived political stressors, and this is going to play out in how they perceive the elections, how they perceive the outcome of elections, and politics, not just at the presidential, but at a plethora of levels, right? Thus, then moving on really quickly from this idea of white fragility, it's important to kind of talk about kind of what this looks like, or some things that can really play to this. So first, again, I talked about a little bit, is the kind of demographic shifts, right? That will make the country a kind of minority majority country, kind of in an intermittent future kind of a flip, right? So one of the things that's really kind of played, that kind of really led to this, was the election of a first Black president, right? That is one of the kind of first kind of instances for which you kind of see that that an ethnic minority, in this case African Americans, have potential to kind of really play a significant role in the political landscape, and particularly when it comes to electing the highest office, in the country. This really then constituted a threat to white Americans with a sufficiently high attachment to white identity, who also fear that this change of relative status will do worse to their material well-being. So you really see this played a lot in the idea of the first Black president, and the fear that he's going to be the first Black president. Now, all of a sudden, all these material interests and the material well-being of whites is going to be decreased at the expense of Blacks. He's going to do all these things for Black people, right? And he's going to be a Black president. And this really kind of played out in the politics of President Obama, who had to concede and make all these speeches you see out in this book, where he had to purposely go out of his way as not to come off as perceiving himself or in the media or by the masses to be this over identifying African American or Black male, right? So this idea then of having a Black president and seeing a kind of an increasing diverse population really kind of plays into the fear then of whites and their change and their status in this country, which again, since its founding, has really been first-class citizens, right? Having increased the country, and the institutions that are kind of maintained throughout its moral fabric and political fabric and economic fabric are kind of built to their advantage. So when you see a Black president and then changing minority majority kind of demographics, then these kind of really first then kind of hint at this kind of growing white fragility, this kind of growing fear based on this kind of changing or perception and the change and the relative status of whites' material well-being. This is also important, of course, when we're talking about the 2020 election and in its future in particular, because democracy by design, right, is supposed to kind of allow minorities to have, at least in some ways, the same opportunity or access to politics that whites have when it comes to kind of power in electoral politics, right? The kind of one person, one vote, that even throughout the idea of government, that then the white majority will still have some kind of advantage, but there's still some kind of decision making that the minority populations will still have access to, right? That democracy in many ways is supposed to be some kind of compromise, where at least where minorities have, at least in some instances, some kind of equal access or equal power in the kind of decision-making process with the kind of one vote, one person kind of ideology, right? But for white Americans, though, and we're talking about, again, a changing demographic of minority majority interest, then democracy really ultimately empowers the resources of their perceived threats, right? So when you're talking about the white dominant majority, and then the more democracy really does with the one person, one vote, then it really ultimately empowers the source of ethnic minorities and African Americans again in this country for them, right? Because it is in some instances the one, and especially with electoral college, one could argue, then it really then presents this opportunity for which access to politics, even if whites have a dominant majority, right, because of the non-monolithic makeup of whites and a plethora of fields, economically, socially, and otherwise, that democracy really opens the door then for there to be some the growing friction within the white dominant majority to be exposed and thus then kind of bordered by other ethnic groups then, for which access to the white dominant majority can then be somewhat be shifted into the hands of other ethnic groups. Thus, it ultimately and then empowers in this case, and thus then the kind of fear of immigrant voting, the fear of increased African American voters then is that power that comes with that access to politics then is empowering, and thus you can shift, or the perception is that the material well-being of whites can be shifted from them to other ethnic groups through the political process, through the democratic process with the one person, one vote, right? This, and what we have seen in the post-2020 election, really, which is important, this has really led whites, and there's been some statistics about the health of democracy, and some research currently being done on the health of democracy. This really has leads whites to abandon the idea, the false dreams of equality and democracy, right? That what we have seen and what we will continue to see, I would argue, is that as these demographics continue to change, the 2020 election resulting in the January 6th insurrection will continually kind of highlight this idea that whites are not really looking for equality and democracy. What they really want is equality and democracy amongst themselves. And the changing racial demographics in this country are continually pointing out to the white dominant majority that this idea of an equal and democratic America is not one that can be successfully accomplished with whites having to play on an equal playing field with other ethnic groups in this country, whereas it can be perceived as equal and democratic amongst themselves, and on the outside of the country, it can be perceived as an equal and egalitarian or democratic country. But the health of this country really has, from its very founding, only been successful, and this country has only been successful and only been healthy because whites have been able to have a privileged place in this country at the expense of other ethnic groups, and have been able to squash and have been able to punish ethnic minorities, and in particular in African Americans, throughout the democratic process, in addition to socially, in addition to politically, because of the kind of strengths of that white dominant majority. And so when we're talking about equality and democracy, what whites really mean is equality and democracy for themselves. And the idea of America and the idea of the American dream and American democracy can only be accomplished with whites on the top and other ethnic groups coming at the expense down at the bottom, right? Thus, what we have seen throughout a plethora of elections, not just in 2020 or 2016 or 2018 to the midterm elections, that previous presidents have always used this kind of racial outgroups or the kind of threatening growth of Blacks in particular to kind of signal whites. And I think Ian Haney Lopez writes a book about dog whistle politics that kind of highlights about this. The Nixons and the 60s using law and order and the Southern strategy to kind of mobilize whites, right? About the continued threat of Blacks and Blacks getting the right to vote and having to work alongside and live alongside Blacks, and what that means for kind of law and crime and economically and for your wages, and the Southern strategy and the vote and Democrats and everything else it is. The same thing happened with Reagan and the kind of welfare queen rhetoric, and the same thing that happens later on in the first 90s with George H.W. Bush and Willie Horton. And the same thing, of course, then took place last with Mitt Romney, talking about, Hispanics, America, made it so hard that they would self-deport, which is a very interesting thing. Thus, then moving from this idea, right, from of white fragility, kind of the kind of what it kind of comes from, and the kind of roots of it, and how it kind of plays out. It's also then kind of heightened important then to move on to the kind of the 2020 election, the kind of and what it has kind of led to, this growing threat, this growing racial demographic of the country has really led to the kind of apex in this idea of what is now currently calling kind of anti-factual intellectual history, anti-fact politics, and everything else it is. So this kind of growing fear and white fragility and really kind of leads to a delusion of and lack of political sophistication in politics when you're talking about then what's to be believed and what to be believed, and what we have and what has been continually being seen and being noticed, not only in the abandonment of the idea of American equality and democracy, it's also this idea of course of political sophistication and objective facts and political realities, right? And how far then whites are willing to go to in order to strengthen and continually reinforce whiteness as a political identity at the expense of the country as a whole, of democracy, and of political realities, right? So in the 2020 election, we saw a plethora of examples of this, right? One of the biggest ones, of course, was that idea of voting by mail, right? That it was unconstitutional, when of course we've known that voting by mail has been a feature of every American election since the Civil War, right? And that it just so happened that with 2020, of course, we had the COVID-19 pandemic. And so, of course, then more votes were cast by mail in 2020 because of the pandemic and the kind of fears and that people had, and the increased early access to voting that took place there as well. Some other crazy claims that were made post-2020 election were, of course, more votes were cast than people who were actually registered to vote. The unexplained surge in Democratic votes late in the night that took place, especially I think that Trump made a comment that 11 o'clock he was winning, and by 11:30 or 11:29, of course, all these votes came in and it would not. And so the idea, of course, that all these votes had flipped then in the middle of the night from Trump to Biden. But these spikes can easily be explained and accounted for when you're talking particularly about the timing of the release. If you're watching, election night, the timing of the release of the large batches of results that took place, especially in big cities like Milwaukee and Atlanta and Detroit and Philadelphia, which are always heavily skewed, heavily Democratic, and some of the most diverse populations in these places. So when you have, and particularly these heavily ethnic, African American districts and heavily Democratic districts leaning, and these people also have to stand in line because they've got one polling place per 100,000 people or more. So you got people sitting in line 4 or 5 hours. And it's no surprise, of course, that if you continue to then have these votes continue to come in, that the later on that as it gets, that those results are going to come in later on as it gets. So one of the things that continues this bug my mind is why, of course, then, why those votes are being counted in last when you think those votes will be counted in first. But the optics of it is that at 11 o'clock, they have all the other districts out. And even though they say that only, 90% of the votes are in, that the optics are, of course, is about 11 o'clock and people are ready to go to bed. Oh, that is that, Trump is winning. And you wake up in the next morning, of course, there's only to find out that, that Biden had overcome him in the election. But again, the results of these big cities, again, Milwaukee, Atlanta, Detroit, Philadelphia, that came in later on the night, of course, really kind of was an optics problem. The idea that the voting machines are owned by Democrats, with Dominion and everything else it is, and the other claim that thousands of dead people also voted in the 2020 elections, right? These are just to kind of highlight again just some of the wild claims that we talk about. We're talking in particular to kind of how white identity reinforces in the kind of and the leaps and bounds of their political imagination that they're willing to espouse when there is a perceived racial threat to their perceived standing and the status of this country, right? Thus, then, when there's a threat to the kind of their American standing politically and economically, and in many cases probably socially as well, the kind of fabric of American kind of understanding of democracy, political sophistication, and kind of grace and transfer of power, and all those things go right out the window for the white dominant majority. Again, they're ease for which they're willing to kind of abandon, the kind of equality and issues of equality and democracy at the expense of maintaining the kind of status quo of their racial standing. Really kind of highlights this point, and the idea to accept and to embrace and promote and continually espouse ignorant and completely delusional, anti-factual and objective ideas is another step in that process for what we've seen in the 2020 election and what we've kind of seen in the kind of post-2020 election continually rhetoric. But on that note, then to kind of highlight what we mean, we're talking about white fragility and why it has resulted in the January 6th, insurrection, and kind of what it means as far as the kind of hostility of American, future American politics really is. The facts of it really kind of began prior to 2020, and it really kind of starts in the 2018 midterm elections, right? In 2018, we had in the midterm elections had the kind of most diverse group of candidates ever, right? And so if that was, of course, when Democrats overtook the House of Representatives from the Republicans. So there's always kind of this growing sense that the Democrats' path to kind of regaining or retaking over at least the White House and maybe switch to the Senate was really going to be in this increased mobilization of the kind of diverse candidates, diverse electorate, and a diverse population and everything else of this. So as a result of the 2018 midterm elections that saw the most diverse group of candidates ever, 2020 had the most diverse and most well-educated electorate in U.S. history, right? So the American population had, and those of eligible voters had been the most diverse and the most well-educated, right? So in particular, there was an increase in 4.8 million immigrant voters who now make up 9.3% of the American electorate. And in 2016 election in particular, of course, with the economy, immigration continues to be and will probably continue to be for a while, a very important issue and a very polarizing issue that really kind of motivates and drives elections and really kind of drives Republican conservatives and a significant portion of the white dominant majority to the polls with this idea of immigration. Thus, a kind of increased immigrant voters, thus then again runs right into the wheelhouse, is the kind of foundation of what would kind of reinforce the perception then again of that white racial standing and the perceived threat of their racial status. Thus, immigration continues to kind of be again a very highlight the political kind of argument in every single election. So we've got in 2020 the most diverse and well-educated electorate in U.S. history, right? Also in 2020, then the electorate candidates and the people on the ballot were the most diverse in U.S. history, right? So we had over 300 female candidates and over 500 LGBTQ candidates in the 2020 election. There was a record number of Black women, 24 overall, I believe, who took office in the House of Representatives. So you're getting the most diverse candidates, you're getting the most diverse kind of electorate, you're getting some of the most diverse issues and well-educated population to help divide and decide on these issues in the 2020 election. And not just going back to 2018, but again, to really kind of, again, highlight this kind of this idea and the importance when we're talking about this issue of why the 2020 election and its growing aftermath really come down to in terms of white fragility, again, is that each of the last 4 Congresses have all been more racially and ethnically diverse than the previous one. So for the last 4 Congresses, each one is getting more and more diverse. Okay, so again, think about in the makeup when we're talking about over time of white fragility and the kind of changing demographic of the country, and every election, they are noticing that they are getting more women, and it's getting more diverse, and it's getting more Black, and it's getting more Native American, it's getting more Hispanic, and it's getting more LGBTQ members in the rest of this, right? That the electorate, and it was important to highlight, and as I mentioned those first few slides, is that access to democracy is as being perceived as the main vehicle for which material resources will be transitioned from the white dominant majority to other ethnic groups, right? Thus then, as Congress gets more and more diverse, the perception is that these Congresses will then be more likely than to transfer the material interest from the white dominant majority to the other ethnic groups that represent them or represent the kind of makeup of the country. So as every Congress gets more racially diverse, then the country gets more racially diverse. The perception is that the white material standing in this country thus then must be, because the perception of a zero-sum political standing, then that the status of whites then must be eroding if the Congress is getting more diverse and the country is getting more diverse and the electorate's getting more diverse, then that must mean that it is coming at the expense of whites. And the idea of at the expense of whites is a very important notion in this discussion. That again, that progress by other ethnic groups, in particular African Americans and others, that the progress must be coming at the expense of whites. Thus, then the seats that are being in the House are becoming so diverse. Those seats must be coming at the expense of whites who should have the advantage of having those seats and probably should elect those seats. Not to say that blacks or other ethnic groups should have zero, but the idea, of course, that the fact that this changing demographic is increasing and steadily increasing election by election, right? That these must be coming at the expense of whites. And the idea of the last four Congresses becoming more racially and ethnically diverse than the previous ones is very important to kind of highlight in that. And a few other points to kind of highlight is that New Mexico was the first state to elect an all women of color to the House of Representatives there. Tennessee elected the first openly LGBTQ politician to serve in its General Assembly. Missouri, of course, elected its first Black woman to the House of Representatives. And Texas had its most diverse electorate and political and elected officials on its ballot in 2022 as well. So you're seeing, again, this just an increased amount of diversity across the board in the demographics, in the electorate, and of course then on the ballot. Thus, then what this really can is to kind of highlight, talking about what we've seen from the 2020 election, what it means for the aftermath and discussion and what we see in America and go. The January 6th insurrection, it really kind of represents the results of the growing white fragility and the actions that will be produced and an increasing white fragility when it comes to the political standing then of whites, and the perceived threat to political standing really comes in this country, right? That's what January 6th really highlighted then, is how whites generally feel about America and feel about this country. 2016 was about making America great again, and this idea of making America great and putting America first. And that was just really at the foundation of really what whites were really thinking about this country. So it's not as simple as just pointing to Trump and just saying, this is just Trumpian politics, right? These changing demographics in the country have been going on for a long period of time. And it really kind of started with the election, again, as I stated at the beginning, with the election of a Black president, right? The highest seat in office. And if African Americans have access to that, then there is no telling what they may have access to in the future. And especially, again, using the democracy and the power of the vote and access to politics as the gauge of transferring that power, then really begins with this idea of really beginning prior to Trump, and that the kind of that the post-Trump or the Trump politics then really kind of is another step in the process of this growing resentment, growing hostility that whites are feeling and having over a changing country. Thus, then on January 6th, what we really had is just a boil over of frustration then of an expression of this white fragility, really feeling that whites feel that there really is two Americas within this one America, right? That there is and that the protection and the interest of American democracy is only practical and only functions properly and is only efficient, again, with whites being a dominant majority and being the political and economic mainstream, and all other ethnic groups, in particular African Americans and others, coming at their expense then, right? So one of the things that really came up in the January 6th insurrection then about cheating and elections being stolen really highlights about this idea of two Americas, is that the only way Blacks and other ethnic minorities can win elections is by cheating, right? That there must be then mail voter fraud, that they must be letting the polls, or that they must be throwing some in the garbage, right? That the only way that they can have won, not only get a Black president, but then to have just an increased more voters than there's ever been before, and a more diverse electorate, then that these changes can only become through cheating, right? They got an illegitimate Black president, and now we've got ballots being driven across state lines and some being thrown away, and we've got unmarked ballots. And so the idea in this two Americas then is one to really kind of highlight the idea then is that if there's a political shift being taken and demographics are taking place in the electorate, then that those Blacks are not only winning seats at the expense of whites, but they must be cheating or must be doing something shady in really order to do so, right? Thus, then, most importantly, then under the idea really is then that democracy, or the idea in this country then, and what January 6th really highlighted, is that whites really feel that democracy is really for them and not for everyone else, right? That the founding fathers meant it to be this way, and that even you saw and Dred Scott and then Supreme Court decisions where they or reinforced that whites had no, or that blacks had no rights or constitutional citizenship rights that whites or anybody else, had to respect and or honor. That what they were again and highlighting then that this American experiment was not meant to be one of equality. It was not meant to be ethnically diverse. It was not meant to have diverse ideas and opinions. It was meant for whites to express their diverse opinions and be the overseer bearers, and that there was at no point were African Americans or any other ethnic group meant to be equals to whites, especially politically. Under no circumstances did they ever envision a moment in time for which African Americans or any other ethnic group would be political equals to whites. This is why, prior to slavery, and we're talking about, from Jefferson and even on to Lincoln and many of the founding fathers, that under no circumstance was the idea that when the slaves would be freed, and many believe that it was eventually what happened, that those newly freed slaves would ever be U.S. citizens or even stay in the country, right? They purchased Monrovia and had ideas of other colonized states that they planned to or ship them back to Africa and everything else. The idea that the founding fathers and many of the first presidents of this country never envisioned and did not plan, and that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence was not meant to be one of racial equality. It was not meant to be a document, or was not meant to be used to build an America in which whites would play and participate on an equal playing field with blacks, and that many voters and many of the older voting age, when people think about racial progress in this country, refuse to realize is that that we aren't too far behind as far as blacks barely having access and the right to vote. And so this idea that, not only, they've been trained for so long and have been taught, that whites were in a place of privilege and of understanding that African Americans were not even citizens. And when they became citizens, they were still second-class citizens and didn't really have, and didn't really have a culture or a status which was bound to be respectful. And now you're trying to tell blacks tell whites that African Americans can be president, it can be on the Supreme Court, and they can be CEOs and managers now, and they can vote on an equal playing field alongside you. And this is coming at as a big shock, again, a stressor to the white dominant majority, who never perceived, and the founding fathers reinforced this, never had an idea or an expectation that American democracy would be one of racial equality or political democratic equality, for which they would have to participate equally with blacks and other ethnic groups, right? And so when we're talking about the Constitution and other things, that what January 6th in particular highlights is that whites have the right to violent protest and not anyone else, right? When we talk about the protests all summer long in places like Portland and Kennewick, Wisconsin, and in Kentucky and everywhere else, this after the brutal George Floyd murder and everything else it is in Breonna Taylor and the protests in Portland, Oregon, what you've seen is, and then you allow people to bum rush the state, the nation's capital, and storm the Senate floor, and people to sit in Nancy Pelosi's office and to take pictures, in the chamber. And many white Americans have, feel like they, that they have equal access to that, and that the moral obligation or that the injustice is not at the hands of those who committed such a heinous act, really means is that it is okay for whites to be frustrated with government, and that whites have every right to kind of vent and demonstrate their frustration with the American government. But African Americans and other ethnic groups, you have no reason or no right to violent protest for any reason whatsoever. I mean, again, in the case of African Americans and for some others, you should be grateful and be thankful, right? To be freed and to even have access from slavery to even be. You had a black president. What do you have to complain about? You're in the Supreme Court. You have billionaires. What do you have to complain about? You have no reason to be frustrated. We, the white dominant majority, now we've got a reason to be frustrated, and we have the right to storm the Capitol and violent protest. But anyone else has no reason to complain about the kind of status or the kind of expectations of the American government. If anybody does, it's the white dominant majority, and we saw that highlighted again on January 6th, which again highlights the point we're talking about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the kind of institutional framework of this country, is that the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence is their document. They see the Bill of Rights, the American Constitution, as highlighting and carving out their rights and their interests and their institutions. But the founding fathers meant for the American government to be one of the white dominant majority and to serve in their best interests. And what the Constitution does is highlight so. And the fact that they left out African Americans and slaves and Native Americans and Hispanics and women only reinforces the idea that this country was meant to be theirs and meant to be in their best interest. And thus the Constitution and the right to assemble and the right to Second Amendment and the right to violent protest and the right of freedom of speech. You're talking about censorship and woke and cancel culture, that the freedom of speech and all this stuff, that is meant for them, that the Constitution is their document. It highlights their freedoms and any perceived, again, threats, their access to be able to say what the hell they want to say, no matter how racist or ignorant and delusional it may be, that they have the right to say so. They, of all people who founded this country and who wrote the Declaration of Independence of all things, they have the right to say what they want to say and assemble with whoever they want to assemble. And of course, you can't take away their guns and everything else it is. The Constitution is their document, and thus America is their country. And on January 6th, the insurrection was their ability to and their willingness to fight for their country back. The country that their forefathers, they believe, fought for and or died for, and that their parents taught them about, and what their education system has continually reinforced to them is right that America is their country, that their founding fathers founded it, that African Americans and other ethnic groups were to serve them and had no ground bearing for claiming of any first class status in this country, and that it is based upon their interests, and that the institutions that are founded in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence are meant to benefit and serve the interests of the white dominant majority, and that the growing demographic and political changes and diversity continues to serve as a threat to the political standing and the material-based interests of the white dominant majority. And January 6th was an instance for them to fight for their country back. Thus, making America great again is all about going back to a time when this country served the white dominating majority's interests. We think about when you ask anybody when America was great, I bet you they go back to a time for which there was racial segregation and or the white dominant majority was the heterosexual norm and the political, economic, and social norm, and the mainstream culture was predominantly steered and promoted and espoused by the white dominant majority. And that is the country that whites want back. That is the country that, again, that they believe that they grew up in, that was the country that their grandparents grew up in, that their parents grew up in. That is the country that they believe the founding fathers founded when they founded this country, is this idea of that a country of the white dominant majority's interest, and making America great again. And the idea of America being great again is the idea of going back when the white dominant majority's interest became first, and they had the power and ability to then steer the political and economic interest and social interest then of this country. As a result, then, if democracy is in crisis, which I believe it is, it's a crisis of the ability of prevailing institutions being ill-suited to kind of quietly maintain the status quo as it gets more and more diverse, right? The inability of whites, as this country continually changes demographically in and out of the kind of current status quo into a more racially diverse, and whites then having little and less ability then to be able to punish blacks and other ethnic groups politically and economically, that we'll continue to see just increased fragility and increased expressions and demonstrations of their frustrations as the kind of perceived threat to their material-based standing in this country, and the kind of overall status and standing of whites overall then continues to diminish. So it's important, lastly, again, just in conclusion, to kind of highlight when we're talking about what this means then of the 2020 election and the growing demographics and changes in this country. We're talking about the 2020 election and in the future presidential elections, and as this idea of that kind of changing demographics in this country and politically, right, really kind of lead to the perceived threat and the changing material-based standing of whites in this country, used through democracy as a tool for which voting is the kind of main instrument for which equality is espoused through politics, for which the kind of transfer of interest and material-based rights can kind of be transferred from one group to another, and that these growing, changing demographics then continually highlights for whites that these growing demographics and changes to politics must be coming then at their expense. And if this country was founded by their forefathers and the founding fathers meant it to be their country, that they're going to be willing to fight for those interests and fight for that country. And if anyone has the right to do so, they believe it is them. And when any ethnic group or any group in this world has ever felt so passionately that they had a divine right or had some historical traditional right of privilege to any space and or place that they felt willing to fight for, that the health and well-being of that nation's institutions, politically, socially, and culturally, are all going to be threatened and are all most likely then to erode. And thus then, what we will see and we'll hopefully follow in the coming stages of American history then is how those changing demographics continually play out, and the response then that whites will continually have then to those changes. I thank everybody again for listening and for hanging in there throughout this lecture. I really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure to participate and to have this be there for you guys. So thank you. I look forward to Q&A. I appreciate this opportunity and I hope you enjoy. Thank you.